Hello guys, we are back again, Mr. Popper's Penguins. We are going to read chapters 11 and 12, but first let's review chapters 9 and 10 that you read last time. Chapter 9 was called In the Barbershop. Remember, they were finishing up their walk and they ended up walking into the barbershop, kind of trying to get away from everybody. They went out the back door, made the barber in the shop very unhappy. They walked out the back door and Captain Cook wanted to go up the stairs, so Mr. Popper obliged and they all went upstairs. And then all of a sudden, both of them were going down the stairs on their belly, which sounds terribly uncomfortable, but that's what they did, and that's what penguins do, right? They slide on their belly, and so they went down the stairs like that. And when he got home, he looked all kinds of crazy because, he just slid downstairs. So, chapter 10 was called Shadows. This is the one where Captain Cook is acting kind of sick almost. Something's just, not quite right with him. And everybody seems very concerned. At first, maybe he's just mopey, they try to get him to the vet. They try to cool him off in the ice box, pills from the vet. Nothing seems to be working. The neighbors all try to help him too. They're all kind of thinking he's, a pretty cool penguin now. He's not dangerous, so they like him. So they're bringing him broths and jellies and trying to get him to eat because he won't eat anything. Somebody made a frozen custard, but he was too far gone. So he ends up sleeping all day and he just didn't know what to do. So Mr. Popper didn't know what to do with him because he was so sick. So he ended up writing a letter to Dr. Smith, who was the curator at the Great Aquarium in Mammoth City. Well, there, he also had a girl penguin named Greta, who was in the same boat. She was very mopey and very lonely. And so he writes back to Mr. Popper and says, well, I'm sending you a penguin. So maybe they can help each other. We'll see. So chapter 11 is called Greta, which, by the way, is a cute name for a penguin. I love the name Greta. So cute. Okay, Greta. So Captain Cook did not die, after all. There were two penguins in the refrigerator, one standing and one sitting on the nest under the ice cubes. They're as like as two peas, said Mrs. Popper. As two penguins, you mean, answered Mr. Popper. Yes, but which is which? At this moment, the standing penguin jumped out of the ice box, reached inside, and took one of the checkers from under the sitting penguin, whose eyes were closed in sleep, and laid it at Mr. Popper's feet. See, Mama, he's thanking me, said Mr. Popper, patting the penguin. At the South Pole, that's the way a penguin shows its friendship, only it uses a stone instead of a checker. This one must be Captain Cook, and he's trying to show that he's grateful to us for getting him Greta and saving his life. Yes, but how are we going to tell them apart? It's very confusing. I will go down in the cellar and get some white paint and paint their names on their black backs. And he opened the cellar door and started down, nearly tripping when Captain Cook unexpectedly tobogganed down after him, on his belly. When he came up again, Mr. Popper had a brush and a small paint can in his hands, while the penguin had a white Captain Cook on his back. Gook, said Captain Cook, proudly showing his name to the penguin in the icebox. Gaw, said the sitting penguin, and then squirming around in her nest, she turned her back to Mr. Popper. She was ready for hers. So Mr. Popper sat down on the floor in front of the icebox while Captain Cook watched, first with one eye, then with the other. Well, what are you going to call her? asked Mr. Popper. Greta. It's a nice name, said Mrs. Popper, and she seems like a nice bird too. But the two of them fill the icebox, and pretty soon there will be eggs, and the next thing you know, the icebox won't be big enough for your penguins. Besides, you haven't done a thing about how I'm going to keep the food that we have cold. I will, my love, promised Mr. Popper. It is already pretty cold in the middle of October, and it will soon be cold enough outside for Captain Cook and Greta. Yes, said Mrs. Popper, but if you keep them outside the house, they might run away. Mama, said Mr. Popper, you put your food back in the icebox tonight, and we will just keep Greta and Captain Cook in the house. Captain Cook can help me move the nest to the other room. Then I will open all the windows and leave them open, and the penguins will be comfortable. They will be comfortable, all right, said Mrs. Popper, but what about us? We will be cold. Well, we can wear our winter overcoats and hats in the house, said Mr. Popper, as he got up to go around and open all the windows. It certainly is colder, said Mrs. Popper, sneezing. The next few days were even colder, but the Poppers soon got used to sitting around in their overcoats. Greta and Captain Cook always occupied the chairs nearest to the windows. One night, quite early in November, there was a blizzard, and when the Poppers got up in the morning, there were large drifts of snow all over the house. Mr. Popper wanted to get her broom and have Mr. Popper bring his snow shovel to clear these drifts away, but the penguins were having so much fun in the snow that Mr. Popper insisted it should be left right where it was. Sounds like a blast. In fact, he even went so far as to bring a garden hose up from the basement and sprinkle all of the floors that night until the water was an inch deep. By the next morning, all of the Popper floors were covered in a smooth ice with snow drifts around the edges near the open windows. I don't know about you, but that sounds like a lot of fun to me. Both Greta and Captain Cook were tremendously pleased with all of this ice. They would go up on the snowdrift on one end of the room and run down one behind the other onto the ice until they were running too fast to keep their balance. Then they would flop on their stomachs and toboggan across the slippery ice. This amused Bill and Janie so much that they tried it too on their stomachs of their overcoats. This in turn pleased the penguins greatly. Then Mr. Popper moved all of the furniture in the living room to one side so that the penguins and the children would have plenty of room for real sliding. It was a little hard at first to move the furniture because the feet of the chairs had been frozen to the ice. So here's a picture of them in their house. Looks like a lot of fun. It also looks really cold. Toward afternoon, the weather got warmer and the ice began to melt. Now, Papa, said Mrs. Popper, you really must do something. We can't go on like this. But Captain Kirk and Greta are both fat and sleek, and the children have never been so rosy. It must be very healthy, said Mrs. Popper, as she mopped the flood, but it's very untidy. I will do something about it tomorrow, said Mr. Popper. And there's a picture of Greta with her name. So cute. All right, chapter 12, more mouths to feed. I wonder what that's going to be about. More mouths to feed. Let's see. So the next day, Mr. Popper called an engineer and had a large freezing plant installed in the cellar and took Captain Cook and Greta down there to live. Then he had the furnace taken out and moved upstairs into the living room. It looked very odd there, but as Mr. Popper said, it was a relief at least not to have to wear their overcoats all the time. Mr. Popper was quite worried when he found that all of these changes were going to be very expensive. The refrigerating engineer was worried too when he found that Mr. Popper had practically no money. However, Mr. Popper promised to pay as soon as he could, and the man let him have everything on credit. He's a very nice man. It was a good thing that Mr. Popper got the penguins moved when he did, because Mrs. Popper had been right about the eggs. The rookery had scarcely been moved to the basement when Greta laid her first egg. 3 days later, the second one appeared. Since Mr. Popper knew that penguins lay only 2 eggs a season, he was astonished when, a little later, the third egg was found under Greta. Whether the change in climate had changed the penguins' breeding habits, Mr. Popper never knew, but every third day a new one would appear until there were 10 in all. 10 eggs. Now penguin eggs are so large that the mother sits on only one at a time, and this created quite a problem. Mr. Popper solved it, however, by distributing the extra eggs under hot water bottles and electric heating pads, kept just at penguin body heat. Excuse me, guys. Sorry about that. The penguin chicks, when they began to hatch, were not so handsomely marked as their mother and father. They were fuzzy, droll little creatures who grew at a tremendous rate, so they grew really fast. Captain Cook and Greta kept busy, bringing them food, and of course the Poppers all helped too. Mr. Popper, who had always been such a great reader, had no difficulty in thinking of names for penguin children. They were Nelson, Columbus, Louisa, Jenny, Scott, Magellan, Adelina, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria. Still, he was rather relieved that there were no more than 10 to name. Mrs. Popper, too, thought that this was about enough penguins for anybody, though they really did not make much difference to her in all of her housework, as long as Mr. Popper and the children remembered to close the cellar door in the kitchen. The penguins all loved to climb the stairs that led up to the kitchen and never knew when to stop unless they found the kitchen door closed. Then, of course, they would turn around and toboggan down the steps again. This made rather a curious noise sometimes when Mrs. Popper was working in the kitchen. But, she got used to it, and she had got used to so many other strange things that winter. The freezing plant that Mr. Popper had got for the penguins downstairs was large and good. It made very large blocks of ice instead of small cubes, so that soon Mr. Popper had made a sort of ice castle down there for the 12 penguins to live and climb all over. Mr. Popper also dug a large hole in the cellar floor and made a swimming and diving pool for the birds. From time to time, he would throw a live fish in the pool for the penguins to dive for. They found this very refreshing because, to tell you the truth, they had got a little tired of canned shrimps. The live fish were specially ordered and were brought all the way from the coast in tank cars and glass boxes to 432 Proudfoot Avenue. Unfortunately, they were quite expensive. Remember, not a whole lot of money. It was nice that there were so many penguins because when two of them, usually Nelson and Columbus, got into a fight, they began to spar at each other with their flippers. The 10 other penguins would all crowd around to watch the fight and make encouraging remarks. This made a very interesting little scene. Mr. Popper also flooded a part of the cellar floor for an ice rink, and here the penguins often drilled like a sort of small army in fantastic marching movements and parades around the ice. The penguin Louisa seemed especially fond of leading these marching drills. It was quite a sight for them to see after Mr. Popper had the idea of training Louisa to hold a small American flag in her beak while she proudly led in the solemn parades. Janie and Bill would often bring their little friends home from school with them, and they would all go down and watch the penguins for hours. At night, instead of sitting and reading and smoking his pipe in the living room, as he had done before, Mr. Popper would put on his overcoat and take his things downstairs. There he would sit and read, with his mittens on, looking up from time to time to see what his little pets were doing. He often thought about the cold, distant regions in which the little creatures really belonged. Often, too, he thought of how different his life had been before the penguins had come and kept him occupied. It was January now, and already he dreaded to think of the time when spring would come and he would have to leave them all day and go back to painting houses. He really likes these penguins. He's already getting sad about having to leave them. All right, that was the end of that chapter. We will read some more next time. Hope y'all are doing wonderful. Bye, guys.